Good evening. On behalf of the Indiana University College of Arts and Sciences, I would like to thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Vanessa Clow, and I serve as the college's Director of Alumni Engagement. Our Food for Thought live streaming series serves as an opportunity for our alumni and friends to hear from faculty experts, explore topics of interest, and stay connected with IU and the College of Arts and Sciences, regardless of your location. At this time, I'm delighted to introduce tonight's featured presenter, Professor and Department Chair of Political Science, Aurelian Craiutu. Professor Craiutu's research focuses on French political thought, political ideologies, and comparative political theory. He has authored and edited numerous books on these topics, including Why Not Moderation? Letters to Young Radicals, which is the focus of tonight's presentation. Excuse me. He has taught at several international institutions and received numerous fellowships and awards, including the Leo Strauss Award from the American Political Science Association. Following his presentation, Professor Craiutu will be joined by Professor Emeritus of Philanthropic Studies and Public Policy, Leslie Lenkowski, for the audience Q&A session. Professor Lenkowski's research centers on philanthropy, social entrepreneurship, and public policy. He has served in various leadership roles, including CEO of the Corporation for National and Community Service, president of the Hudson Institute, and as a contributor to the Chronicle of Philanthropy. You can submit your questions at any point during this evening's discussion. Simply click on the Q&A tab located in your webinar toolbar. Hover your mouse over your screen and your toolbar should appear. Now, it's my pleasure to welcome Professor Craiutu for his presentation. Thank you.
Good evening. It's a pleasure to be with you this evening, and I'd like to take a moment to thank you for spending precious time and on a very important evening before the presidential debate. I will be following a PowerPoint presentation that we will be relying on, and then we will discuss some important issues that you might be interested in. So I want to start by saying a few things about the motivation that led me to writing Why Not Moderation? Letters to Young Radicals. And this is the second slide, Vanessa, that we may put up on the screen. I've been reflecting on moderation for a long time now, perhaps too much in an immoderate way. But I began writing this book during the pandemic and the controversial 2020 electoral year, when it became painfully evident to all of us how difficult it is to sell a virtue like political moderation, and how much we miss it. Moderation was in short supply then, and as we'll see in a couple of hours, will be in short supply this evening again, to use an understatement. Very little has changed since 2020 in our politics. We still live in a world of hyper-polarization, tribalism, and sectarianism. Many politicians, many activists, and many citizens, frankly, think along the lines of my way or the highway. We live, in other words, in a no-compromise era, an age in which the mentality is us versus them. If we win, they have to lose, and if they win, we stand to lose. We are also living in a world in which many of us are, I would say, infected with the virus of crusading mentality. We need to convince others that they are wrong, that they need to change their views. And to that effect, many of us, many politicians in particular, use litmus tests, purity tests. And no wonder that cancel culture has become a phenomenon on both sides of the political spectrum, not only on the left, but also on the right. This is a book that is born out of the frustration with this atmosphere. And I want to ask a very simple question. That will be the next slide, which is the third of the 12. Can moderation be a successful card in today's politics? The slide presents a tightrope walker walking on a very thin wire at a high altitude. And this is exactly how I visualize moderates today in our world. moderates trying to find a balance to keep their equipoise, their equilibrium in a world in which the winds blow from both sides and the dangers are imminent and quite significant. So what does it take to be a successful moderate in today's world? Next slide, please. To answer this question, I think we need to look at the image of moderation in today's world. And the image is not entirely encouraging. What do we see when we look around us? We see that there's a huge skepticism towards moderation in our world. Moderation is equated too often with being weak, being timid, and indecisive. Moderates are not decisive. That's one of the images of moderation. Others equate moderation with opportunism and a synonym of mediocrity and pettiness. That's another image of moderation. Others go on further to equate moderation with an unsavory center devoid of substance. And that center lacks convictions. And you can see this in the, for example, the sentence of Rush Limbaugh, which is the next slide. By definition, moderates can't be brave. They don't have opinions. Brave moderates, great moderates in American history, show me that book. A very prominent conservative activist who expressed deep skepticism towards moderation. But we have a more, let's say, well-known example of skepticism towards moderation in the work of Barry Goldwater. Extremism in the pursuit of liberty is no vice. Moderation in the pursuit of justice is no virtue. These are the words of Barry Goldwater, the GOP presidential candidate in the 1964 elections. So moderation is seen as, on the one hand, incapable of promoting reforms, and on the other hand, as opposing necessary reforms. So to make a long story short, I think that moderation does have an image problem in our world of fake news, intransigence, and alternative facts. And I'm pretty sure that the conversation that we'll be having later on will add to this skepticism of moderation towards moderation that I have identified as a problem. Next slide, please, which is slide number 6. So the question that I ask myself as a scholar, I'm a historian of political thought, is how to study moderation. What kind of virtue it is, and how should we go about studying it? And I think that one of the important conclusions of my work over 2.5 decades is that moderation is not a simple virtue in itself, and it's not easy to study. It's a virtue in an ethical sense. It's a social practice, an intellectual sensibility, an ethos. It's a way of life. But there's also a set of institutions and a constitutional structure that always go unnoticed or underappreciated. So what I would like to propose from the get-go is that we think about moderation as a tripartite structure, as a virtue, the middle ground between the extremes, as a set of institutions and constitutions that structure our free way of life, and as an ethos, as a way of life. When we talk about moderation in general, we tend to confound these 3 dimensions of moderation, and we speak of moderation in the singular. And in my own work, and in today's talk, I propose that we disentangle that and we speak about phases of moderation rather than about moderation in the singular. Not surprisingly, this is a difficult subject to study. It's a multifaceted and complex virtue that requires, in fact, concrete historical examples and extensive historical forays. So you can't just talk about moderation in general as one would talk about justice or equality or freedom. You need to look at moderates in action. You need to look at moderates' choices, moderates' challenges, and mistakes at times. And I think that's very important because we see that, if it's difficult to be enthusiastic about moderation in the abstract, when we look at historical examples of moderates, let's say George Washington Abraham Lincoln, Benjamin Franklin in the American political tradition, then we can get a sense of what moderates stood for more easily than if we looked at moderation in the abstract. And final point about the study of moderation that I'd like to raise here is that we really cannot understand the richness and the complexity of this virtue if we study it independently of other concepts. So moderation, as I understand it, belongs to what I call a semantic field, which includes related concepts like synonyms, temperance, prudence, mixed government, civility, and antonyms, opposites, such as fanaticism, extremism, and radicalism. So I think that that's very important to highlight from the beginning in order to avoid simplifications of moderation. Next slide, please. Slide number 7. If we are serious about trying to understand moderation, we need to acknowledge, I think, that it forms what I call an archipelago. What's an archipelago? It's a metaphor for a series of islands that are connected, but also disparate in the ocean. And there are some hidden connections underwater between them, but we don't often see them. And I put there on the screen a few interesting quotes from different times, different ages, but also different traditions, starting from ancient China, going to ancient Greece, Rome, and modern Europe, precisely in order to highlight the complexity and the diversity of this archipelago of moderation. The superior man embodies the course of the mean. The mean man acts contrary to the course of the mean. It's a nice play here on the words, but the idea is that moderation is identified here with the mean. The mean is not necessarily the middle, but it's something in between the extremes. And this appears in the famous golden mean as a phase of moderation in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, but other ancients as well. A master of any art, Aristotle wrote, avoids the excess and defect, but seeks the intermediate and chooses this. We can also see moderation as a form of restraint and controls of one's passions, and this is the ethical type of moderation, which overlaps with the Christian tradition, but also other religious traditions. And you can see Montaigne in the 16th century affirming without any hesitation that our most glorious achievement, he wrote, is to live our life fittingly, that is, with moderation. A century later, his compatriot Blaise Pascal wrote that nature has placed us in the middle, and the greatness of human condition consists in knowing how to remain there, in the middle. Finally, we reach Montesquieu, the author of The Spirit of the Laws, who looked at moderation as the supreme virtue of the legislator. And this is what he writes at the end of a long book, The Spirit of the Laws, in Book 29, Chapter 1. I've written this work only to prove it. The spirit of moderation should be that of the legislators. A few years later, John Adams, the American statesman, said, without moderation, every man in power becomes a ravenous beast of prey. As you can see, I chose these quotes not only to illustrate the richness of this tradition of thinking about moderation, but the fact that in reflecting upon moderation, I stand upon the shoulders of giants. John Adams, Montesquieu, Pascal, Montaigne, Aristotle. Cicero could be added here. And I would want to propose what I see as the best and the most inspiring definition of moderation that appears in a religious treatise from 1640 by an Englishman, Joseph Hall, who defined moderation as a silken string that runs through the pearl chain of all virtues. The silken string that runs through the pearl chain of all virtues. This is 1640 Joseph Hall. Now, what's interesting here is precisely the idea that without moderation, all of the other virtues would be meaningless or would be imperfect or incomplete. And this is something that struck me as I was reading these works. The idea appears also in the works of Cicero many centuries before, but this is a stunning formulation that I would like you to remember as you think about moderation. Next slide, please, which is slide number 8. So I think that the question that we should ask is, okay, moderation is a good virtue, but what do moderates stand for? And there are many faces of moderation, as I said at the beginning. And I think that it's important to look at the mentality of those who, like me, but again, I stand on the shoulders of giants, seek to put moderation first. Moderates share a steady preoccupation of political evil, and they seek to avoid the extremes of cruelty, anarchy, and civil war, and they defend the virtues of open society. The concept of open society is a good one because it illustrates precisely the virtues that allow us to have this conversation tonight and allow us to cooperate freely while respecting our diversity of interests and opinions. This is a concept that appears in Karl Popper's fundamental work, The Open Society and Its Enemies. But moderates alone do not defend open society. There are others who also defend open society, so you don't have to be a moderate to defend it only. But this is at the very heart, very core of their political vision. What I think illustrates best their commitment to open society are the virtues of balance and eclecticism. What do I mean by that? There are moments in history when the set of interests on one side of the political aisle tend to overcome the other side. And then moderates are concerned with keeping the ship of the state on an even keel. This is a metaphor that is long-standing in the history of political thought. And moderates are like the captains of the ship, and when the storms batter the ship, they seek to keep it on an even keel. And that's the virtue of trimming. I've not been a sailor in my life so far, but some of you may have been sailing, so you know that this is a nautical metaphor that points to the trimming of the sails in order to work with the winds to keep the ship on an even keel. That's what moderates do, to keep the ship of the state on an even keel. It doesn't mean that they are opportunists in the wrong sense of the word, but they are opportunists in the good sense of the words. They look at opportunities to maintain the ship of the state in balance, in equipoise. That's very important. And this metaphor of trimming, I borrow it from a 1680 essay by the Marquis of Halifax, who wrote a very important text called The Character of the Trimmer. So restoring equilibrium in society is a fundamental virtue for moderates. And to that effect, they tend to adopt some of the soundest attitudes and principles of all parties and facilitate agreements and compromises between them in order to calm passions, lower the temperature, and heal wounds to the extent to which that is possible. So this idea of balance, of trimming, is at the heart of what Montesquieu understood by moderate government, an intrinsically complex form of government based on a judicious balance of powers, checks and balances, healthy pluralism, an effective combination of interests and groups in society. This is not the work of nature, Montesquieu affirmed, but the work of art and skillful legislative design. And I think that this is another important value. Moderates are eclectic in the sense that they combine principles from all parties, liberal, conservative, in the center, in order to promote these checks and balances that maintain the equipoise of the state. Pluralism, of course, helps achieve this goal, and centrism sometimes does the same. There are some interesting examples of moderate agendas that I could give in terms of works of art, but also movements. But I would like to point out that what unites all of them, what they all share in common, are at least two characteristics. One is that they do not practice Manichaeism. Manichaeism is a view of the world that looks and understands the world in stark contrast, colors, black and white. The forces of the evil, the forces of light, pitted against the forces of darkness, the forces of evil. And moderates refuse to understand the world in those terms most of the time. They are also definitely opposed to fanaticism, extremism, and zealotry of all sorts. So this is what all of the moderates seem to have in common. Next slide, please, just slide number 9. And I would like to invite you to reflect with me for a moment on the benefits of moderation understood in this tripartite structure as a virtue, as a set of institutional/constitutional arrangements, and as an ethos or a way of life. The most important one, as I understand it, is that moderation is an alternative to ideology. We live in a highly ideological age in which, again, conservatives are pitted against liberals, liberals against conservatives, and everyone has an ideology that allows one to interpret the world and propose changes to the world. Moderation is different, not in the sense that it doesn't offer changes and a blueprint for change, but it has affinities with different political traditions and can accommodate a wide range of political ideas, views, and forms of government. What moderates are very good at is refusing to define one single best way. There is no panacea. My colleague, the late Elinor Ostrom, who is the only female Nobel Prize winner at Indiana University and the first female winner in economics of the Nobel Prize, used to say that there are no panacea. And this is an expression of moderation right there. There's no single best way. We need to be creative to combine the advantages of different blueprints, different agendas, and yes, different ideologies. So moderates are by nature inclined against perfectionism, against revolutionary changes, and they prefer piecemeal reforms, step by step, gradual reforms, rather than revolutionary changes. Moderates also defend the pluralism of ideas, principles, and interests that, in their view, is essential to maintaining and nurturing freedom, a value to which they are committed in modern society. Now, to this effect, they have a flexible and skeptical mindset, and I see this as an advantage rather than a disadvantage. Changing one's views in light of the changing facts and new discoveries is a value that we should cherish rather than we should condemn. Is the opposite of fanaticism and dogmatism, where one is locked into one single way of seeing things once and forever. Being flexible allows one to learn new things, to correct one's mistake, and to contribute to an ongoing debate that is essential for our life in a free society. And to that effect, moderates and moderation promote civility and compromise. And I think this is exactly what we are lacking today. Moderation promotes civility, allows for reasonable compromises, but of course there are rotten compromises as well, and they need to be denounced. Finally, one of the great advantages and benefits of moderation is that it promotes dialogue, and it is opposed to what I think is one of the greatest evils of our society today, which we'll see later this evening, bubbles and echo chambers. We love talking to people who share our views. We are comfortable being in our bubbles, in our echo chambers, but that comes with a big price. And I think that one of the most important contributions that moderation can make to our life in a modern society is to allow us to fight against the tendency to become self-righteous and to teach us humility and self-restraint. This unwavering commitment to dialogue that we see at the core of moderation can be expressed in the famous sentence, "May the other side also be heard." No ideas should astonish us. No belief should offend us. And we should demand that dissenting views and voices should be heard against our most cherished views. So we should look at the world as a vast school of inquiry in which we combine different traditions, cultures, and religions. And I think this is a great advantage of moderation because it allows us to do so. I would like to conclude with some lessons, or I propose a few rules for what I call radical moderates. This is the next slide, slide 10 out of 12. And this may sound a little bit as immoderate, but I think it's important to keep in mind. So what does this amount to? Well, there are a few propositions that I would like to share with you. Refuse to define one single best way. Examine facts. Be prepared to amend and nuance your beliefs when facts change. Yes, it's important to be able to do so. This doesn't mean opportunism in the wrong sense. You learn new things, you realize you were wrong, you amend your views. Number two, fight against echo chambers and bubbles. Avoid being sectarian, avoid thinking ideologically, keep the lines of dialogue open with your opponents. Rule number 3 would be, do not be a perfectionist. Start with working with the world as is, not as it should be. Defend piecemeal, gradual reforms. Avoid utopian blueprints for change. Gradual reforms do tend to work best. Number 4, do not become obsessed with purity, axis of evil, litmus tests, red lines, and so forth. And most importantly, resist the temptation to divide the universe between the forces of light, goodness, and the forces of darkness or evil. And finally, as I said earlier, no particular belief should hurt us in our political lives. We should admit that most political issues can have and often have more than one side, and as a result, resist the temptation to interpret events in light of one single value or principle, which means that, yes, you may have views on pro-life or pro-choice, but you shouldn't divide the world in those who are on one side or on the other. Second Amendment is here, taxes, another one, healthcare, and so forth. The world has many nuances. So next slide, please. There is, I think, a twofold lesson from all of this. What I want to propose here. One is that without moderation, every man in power becomes a ravenous beast of prey. That's what John Adams said. And I think this is still the case today, 2 centuries after he said that. And I'd like to conclude with a sentence from Albert Camus, the Nobel Prize winner for literature from 1956, who said this: "Our world does not need tepid souls. It needs burning hearts, men who know the proper place of moderation." And I think that that's a very important quote from Camus, because it shows that one can be a moderate and one can be a passionate, even at times radical spirit, but it's always about keeping sight of proportions and using discernment. And this brings me to the conclusion of my talk. I look forward to Professor Lenkowski and your questions. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Aurelian. I'm tempted to say that you have given us an immoderate amount to think about and to discuss. Fortunately, we've got at least a half hour in which to do so. We probably won't be able to discuss all aspects of your talk, but we'll try to get to many, and that's my role here. I'll be moderating. Just a reminder, if you do have questions, please put them in the Q&A section of Zoom. You'll find that by hovering your mouse over the toolbox. I will be reviewing them, maybe combining some, summarizing some to keep the flow of the discussion going. And we will go until Vanessa tells us it's time to call it an evening. Let me start with a big question that one of the people who I think is here tonight asked. I'm rephrasing it a little bit. You mentioned that understanding moderation requires putting it in a historical perspective. So the question is, when did moderation begin to seem in the United States as a weak or incomplete answer to a particular problem or question? When, in other words, did moderation lose its loveliness? I remember, for example, that the end of the world was at hand. Do we date this to 1981, later, earlier? What is the historical background here?
Well, I like to thank you for the question and the person who asked it. It's a difficult question to answer for a variety of reasons. One is that there are multiple points in history when moderation ceased to be an appealing virtue and came back. If you look at, for example, the elections of 1800, that was not a moderate time in American history, but it came only 12 years, right, after we ratified a constitution that is an embodiment of political moderation in some ways, also an embodiment of the imperfections that come with political moderation. Let's not forget the 3/5 compromise, which is a compromise that was needed to secure the ratifying of the Constitution. Not a perfect solution, to say the least. So the ebbs in history, flows and ebbs here. But I would want to point to the fact that only 4 decades ago, apparently the proportion of moderate legislators in Congress was about 40%. Our legislators used to bring their families to Washington, and that allowed them to socialize and have more contact with each other. And they saw themselves not as enemies, but as political opponents, which is a big difference. And I think that something happened after that, when the families of our legislators today no longer move to Washington. Our legislators have a very tight schedule. They leave on Monday, come back on Thursday evening. They don't socialize with each other. They don't have time. They have a lot of work to do. And as a result, the civility and that spirit of accommodation suffered and took a high toll. So closer to us, something happened between 1980s and 1994, maybe 95, and things have changed since. So we haven't changed much. And I deplore this absence of civility and moderation. Someone said that the mark of a civilized society is precisely to be able to go to dinner with members of the opposition and have a good time. And that might have been the case in Victorian England, I don't know, but it certainly was the case in the United States up until 4 decades ago.
Well, just to keep it on this subject, Josh asks, are there currently any elected politicians or maybe public figures, to put it a little broader than that, in the United States who you would believe are acting like the historical figures you described, are trying to advance the cause of moderation? And if so, who are they? We know that perhaps the two we're going to be watching later tonight may not be, but who should we look to?
Well, I like politicians who are prepared to put the country above party. And we can look at those who have done so and those who may be willing to do so right now. I would say that your mentor, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, is a good example of a moderate, a Democrat who had some very conservative things to say at the point in time where the debates on race and inequality was very important. But he is no longer with us. Closer to us, I would say that John McCain illustrates the type of legislator that was willing to put the country above party. And I do remember a scene from the 2008 campaign where a voter stood up and asked a question about President Obama's, I think, racial background or something. And John McCain said, "No, ma'am, he's an honest man. And this is not how we talk about those." So that kind of attitude is inspiring to me. And I think that you find legislators who are still willing to do so. I didn't vote for Mitt Romney in 2012, but if he were today on a ballot, I would be willing to give him my vote. Unfortunately, he's retiring from Senate. So there's no doubt that there are politicians. And I would want to add to the question that we need to look beyond the world of politics at the grassroots level. There are lots of associations, lots of organizations that do tremendous work, that kind of plant the seeds of moderation in our society. Braver Angels is one of them. More in Common is another one. The Heterodox Academy is another one. And Hidden Tribes is another one. So I would want to extend the conversation beyond politicians, because I think that the roots of our, let's say, moderation lie in civil society. And I think that we tend to put our hopes in the big leaders, but we tend to underplay, ignore eventually the importance of moderation at the grassroots level.
leads right into the next set of questions. I'm going to put two together here. One's from Stephen. Okay, you know, as I know, that civil society has been in trouble for many years now. And the famous phrase of Robert Putnam, we've been bowling alone. We don't join associations nearly as much as we used to. So the question from Stephen is, what can our society do to incentivize the citizenry to become more moderate? What changes to our institutions do you think can help accomplish that? And now let me add to that kind of the reverse side of this question. What chance does moderation have in an autocratic society? If your leader, elected or not, is an authoritarian, does moderation have a chance? And is revolution, is radicalism the only real option?
Okay. Thank you for these questions. They overlap with some of the ideas that I have presented in my previous books as well. Let's start with civil society. I mentioned earlier an organization such as Braver Angels. It started as Better Angels in 2016. It was renamed Braver Angels to avoid an overlap with Lincoln's speech. What's interesting here is that what Braver Angels do, they organize workshops in which they invite 5-6 Republicans, 5-6 Democrats, self-identified Republicans and Democrats, to talk about the biases they have about each other's, and they teach them how to listen, to learn how to listen to each other. And I think that this is where it starts. It starts with each of us. I'm reluctant to offer theories about how to, revigorate civil society. It starts with each of us. Do we listen to people who disagree with us? Are we prepared to correct our mistakes? Are we prepared to learn from people who have different views? If we do, then we're on a good path. If we don't, we can talk at length about civil society and bowling leagues and whatever parent-teacher associations. We don't advance. So I think that the focus should be on, and it is, I think, most of the time on each of us. What do we do concretely? Okay, do we get out of our bubble, comfort zone, or we stay within it? And I have to say that it's very comforting to stay within one's bubble, and it's very difficult to get out of it. And I think that most of the time we tend to socialize, and I do the same with friends and people who share our views, and we neglect others who do not. So the question about civil society must start with the question of each of us. There's a great organization, by the way, called It Starts With Us. It was founded by a Jewish Mexican-American businessman whose name escapes me right now, but I'm on the editorial board of that organization, and I'm impressed by what they do, because they emphasize precisely what is needed to listen, to correct one's mistakes, and to reach out to others. The second question is a difficult one: moderation in an autocratic society. I cannot answer in the abstract. I want to give an example here. In my previous book, entitled Faces of Moderation, published in 2017, I examined the case of Adam Michnik. Most of you probably won't be familiar with his name. He is still alive, born in 1946, a famous, legendary figure of the Polish opposition to communism. What the Polish did in the 1970s and 1980s was precisely to create a sense of piecemeal reforms, gradual reforms, that eroded the legitimacy of the communist regime in Poland. The first such organization was called the Committee for the Defense of Workers, that emphasized the importance of defending the rights of those workers who had been fired for political, or arguably non-political, but in reality political reasons. And the emphasis was on defending their rights. And in the 1980, they created the famous labor union called Solidarity. Adam Michnik was involved in the first one, less so in the second one. But the emphasis was on the concept of evolutionary revolution, so to speak. So it's a contradiction here, but it's a step-by-step change. It's basically reform. So you don't change society from top down. You start organizing at the grassroots level, and you use the resources that exist. And in 1980, the Solidarity marked basically the dissolution of the legitimacy of the communist movement. And the communist regime in Poland disappeared as a result of a series of what known in the field as round tables. The opposition and the communists sat down around tables that were arguably round, and they put together a plan for changing the regime, so that on June 4th, 1989, the same day when the Tiananmen massacre occurred in Beijing, there was an election in Poland that was won by the opposition. June 4th, 1989. And this was the result of moderation practiced gradually in an autocratic society. Can this be replicated in other societies? It's hard work, because they had to confront persecution, the threat of Soviet invasion. They had to be patriotic, because they were offered the possibility of going into exile, and they stayed in Poland. So it takes a lot to do so. The other example that I could give is the example of the Soviet dissident Andrei Sakharov, a famous physicist who actually became a dissident. He worked for the system and then became a dissident by emphasizing the importance of individual rights in the Soviet Union. The former Soviet constitution did have some room for rights, but they were never really taken seriously. So what Sakharov did was to precisely use the pretext of those rights to argue for the need for political reforms. Well, those political reforms arrived late after Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 1985, so it took a long time. But that was actually an interesting outcome of a long-standing tradition. Of course, there was the other way of confronting the autocratic society, represented by the great novelist Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who was much more forthcoming and fighting against the communists in the Soviet Union. So moderation can be, under certain circumstances, effective in fighting along those lines, fighting regimes that are autocratic.
Just stay on this a minute more, because I agree with you. Some of the groups you mentioned that have formed in the United States are very encouraging, but these groups, like the program I helped design, AmeriCorps, our national service program, suffer from being voluntary. And so a lot of the people who participate are already inclined toward moderation or civility. Should we be requiring, say, all students who graduate from IU to spend a year in one or another kind of service activity, perhaps to pay back student loans or whatever? Or is that too autocratic a solution to the lack of moderation?
That's a loaded question, Les. And as you know, you were invited in a class that I teach at IU on polarization and civil society, and we discussed with students precisely this question. And the students tend today to dislike anything that is imposed top-down. They like the idea of serving one's community, one's country, but if it's mandated, they dislike it. So there's a contradiction in terms here. Yeah, you like to serve the community, but only when it serves your purpose. And I think that this illustrates a certain mentality in the newer generation, and perhaps the gulf that separates their generation from ours. And I think that gulf is difficult to fill in. It's difficult to accept that you have to do certain things just because they have to be done. So I think that mentality, I would say, autonomous mentality, is very much looming large on the mind of the new generation. My view of it is that it's very important to do some type of work for the communities, to see that there is something larger than yourself, and keeping alive our free way of life requires sacrifice, requires time, requires energy, Otherwise, we can all spend times in the comfort of our homes and forget about letting others do the dirty work of organizing and keeping the republic alive.
Okay, we have several questions that get at a similar point. So Nicholas and Jane have both asked, is becoming a moderate a matter of the head or the heart? And is it possible to change another person's beliefs? And if so, how? And of course, we are here in an educational institution that is presumably concerned with shaping character, among other things. And then from the other side, Spencer has asked, how have major events in American or world history, such as 9/11 or COVID, affected, hastened, or exacerbated the change in moderation you've described? And Kiki raises a similar question, referring to the trauma and experience that people have in life, influencing them to move toward one or another side of the political agenda. So the question is the old one: can we teach people to be moderate? And what happens when we live in a world where events seem to drive us in directions that aren't particularly moderate?
Well, thanks for excellent questions, and I'm here to learn as well. I'm here to share my little knowledge and learn from others. So that's the reason for this conversation. Why would one be a moderate? So I think that there are different reasons for being a moderate. One is you have a temperament that is moderate. You understand the pro and cons. You are inclined to judge pro and con, and you make a decision. So that's a good thing, I would say. And there are people who are blessed with this temperament. They don't jump to a conclusion immediately. They like to step back and think through. I'm not one of them. I'm envious of those who have this disposition. But there are others who become moderate out of experience, historical experience in particular. And I would range myself among those who have learned something from history. I grew up under communism in Romania, and I learned the importance of moderation by looking at examples of immoderation. So history teaches us some lessons, and if we have our eyes to see and ears to listen to, then we can learn certain things, and we can say, okay, moderation has played out pretty well. There are others who become moderates out of fear. Fear plays an important role, and it's not a significant factor here. Fear of cruelty, fear of anarchy, fear of civil war. You want to bring people together, and this is a motivation for many moderates today, at the point in time where I talk about a national divorce, civil war, a new Cold War, and so forth, to espouse moderation. And there's no single, characteristic here that could be highlighted, but I think that this shows that you can be a principal moderate out of fear, out of necessity, out of historical conviction. Now, can we teach people to be moderate? That's a difficult question. Edmund Burke, who is the hero of a previous book of mine, A Virtue for Courageous Minds, defined moderation as a virtue for noble and courageous minds. And I want to emphasize the importance of courage. It takes courage to be against the current. It takes courage to say no when people say yes, and yes when people say no. It takes courage to to remind people of their limits of knowledge. Think about Socrates and Socrates' trial in ancient Athens. And it takes a lot of courage to be able to say, I was wrong. I changed my mind. I made a mistake, but now I think I see better than before. So can we teach people to be all that? Maybe. But I'm not sure. One thing that I can do as an educator, since I'm a college professor, is to teach people that there's a tradition of thinking about moderation and give them examples of moderates in history, as I try to do in today's talk. So I mentioned George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Benjamin Franklin, Adam Michnik. I can fill in here much more if you wish. So we need to study history. We need to teach our students historical examples and let them decide what they like and what they don't. It's not indoctrination here. It's just historical knowledge. And this is a limit of our education today. I teach courses in the history of political thought, and they are seen as difficult. Why? Because they are historical. Why? Because they contain a lot of historical details. Why? Because they've never taken history in high school. And our state now, Indiana, is in the process of making some changes to the curriculum in high school, eliminating even the little history and arts and whatever culture that is being taught from the curriculum, and emphasizing a more vocational training. So we need to look this in a holistic perspective. We need history, we need philosophy, we need religion in order to teach people a way of accommodating differences between cultural, religious, and political traditions. I have had hard time convincing anyone face to face to change one's beliefs, but I do think that it's important to teach people the benefits of acknowledging one's mistakes. It doesn't mean that you change their views, but to be able to say, yes, I was wrong, to teach humility, that's a lifelong endeavor. But to teach someone the need to correct one's mistake, I think that that's easier. It's easier on the one hand, difficult on the other hand, because we live in a world in which fake news, alternative facts are presented around us at all times. So what's south for me, it's north for you, and what's summer for you, it's winter for me. So we need a world of common facts, and if we don't have that, then moderation cannot be taught, and moderation has no chance. The fragmentation of our life into these bubbles, social media bubbles mostly, echo chambers, makes the task of moderation and moderates much more difficult. We need common facts. We need reliance on science. 2 plus 2 makes 4 in any universe, but sometimes 2 plus 2 is 4.5. And we've had these conversations about lots of things, starting with climate change and ending with healthcare. And I think that facts, science, expertise is important, but they are not infallible either. Facts can be not decisive. Science can be deceiving. So life as an experiment, life as an endless problem solving. This is what I would say. And people can learn from that or may not learn.
Okay, we have 3 questions that kind of group together, and then I will have a final question before we end the evening. Nick, Stephen, and Kartiki all ask in different way about institutions. Are there changes we could make, such as ranked choice voting in general elections or others, that might encourage more moderation among elected officials?
Yeah. Thank you for this.
You've referred several times to the media bubbles, but what can we do to deal with the problem, especially of social media, but also the disappearance of local newspapers that, as you know, are so important for Tocqueville and so on? So what institutional changes do you think we could make?
I'm glad some listeners brought up the issue of ranked choice voting, because it's being implemented in some states and it has worked decently well. We are a federation of states. The more the better. The more experiments, the better. This is not the only one, but I think that there's room for more ranked choice voting experimentation in other states. So I hope that other states will do it. Alaska has done pretty well, I think, and it's interesting that Alaska, Nebraska, and Maine have more diverse representation. I think that one of the problems with the chances of moderate politicians this time is that they are outvoted in primaries. So I think that the way in which we think about the primaries may have to change in order to give moderation a chance. I'm not a great fan of changing the Supreme Court composition, but I would say that term limits may be needed. I like tenure. Um, I'm one of the beneficiaries of tenure, though tenure has been attacked even in our state of Indiana. But I think that for such a great institution like the Supreme Court, 2 terms, 2 9-year terms would be, or 2 6-year terms would be in order, at least as a conversation. I'm not sure how to think about changing the electoral college. I don't think it's possible, and I'm not there. With those who propose elimination, we cannot be a country with universal suffrage given the diversity of 50 states. So I'm on the conservative.
What about the media?
The media is an interesting question here, and I do think that most of us do not make informed choices. We take our news from Instagram, X, formerly known as Twitter, and Facebook, and Facebook is for the all people, in case you didn't know that. But local newspapers are in short supply. I do think that when it comes to the social media, it's very difficult to overcome this tendency of echo chambers. I ask my students at the beginning of each class, what do they read? I want to know what they read over the summer or winter, usually summer, and what sources of information they have. And very few have a wide menu of information sources. So if you read Washington Post or New York Times, you should read Wall Street Journal and The Economist, not because the truth is on one side or the other, but because the truth is somewhere in the middle, and you should do it. It's very difficult to do so. We tend to do that. I'm a great fan of The Economist, for example, because in The Economist I can see both sides, and I think that's important. It's very difficult to find those balanced sources. However, in the last few years, there's been some outlets, of news outlets in the United States that are promising, like Persuasion, American Affairs, and others that offer a more comprehensive views than this bigger news channel. So I think that the hope comes from innovation at the grassroots level.
So you have to work at it.
You have to work at it. It's not easy. It's not easy, and it's changing constantly. There's no single. New York Times only would not do it.
Well, so speaking of the media, let me ask you this as our final question before we turn it back to Vanessa. An hour or so after this program ends, many of us will be watching the presidential debate between Vice President Kamala Harris and former President Donald Trump. What question or questions would you like to see the media moderators ask that would give us some insight into how each of them thinks about moderation?
Well, we'll have to wait and see how it goes.
But if you were the moderator, what would you ask to, I mean, given that we're skeptical of the moderation of either, is there something you'd ask, see who might be more or less?
Yeah, I would ask a very simple question: is what have you learned from your opponent, and what virtues you admire in him or her, and we'll have to see how it works.
What about if you ask them to explain a mistake they made?
Yeah, that's also very, very valuable, and it may be asked, I think, especially with regard to the changes in opinions. But it has a political turn. So I would like to see is there anything you admire in your opponent, and why?
Okay, well, I think that's a good way and a hopeful way to end this. We will see whether these questions are asked, and we will see how things go. But we've all been informed by your presentation tonight, Aurelian, and hopefully emboldened to be warriors for moderation. So thank you very much.
Thank you for being with us, and thank you, Les and Vanessa, for making this possible.
Thank you again for joining us and participating in this evening's live stream. I would like to personally thank Professors Craiutu and Lenkowski for their time and expertise. We are grateful to you all. Finally, I should acknowledge that events like this would not be possible without the support of donors who understand the value of a liberal arts education. If you would like to support programs like tonight's presentation or other opportunities that connect alumni and friends with the College of Arts and Sciences, please consider making a contribution to the IU Bloomington College Alumni Engagement Fund at the Indiana University Foundation. We look forward to connecting with you soon, but until next time, take care.